Diep stood before the camera. Her smile warm. Her eyes reflecting a quiet strength that had been forged through years of solitude. She thanked those who had followed her journey. Those who had witnessed every fragile step toward the life she was slowly building. On a small hill covered in pomelo trees. The little house she had worked so hard for was finally taking shape. It wasn't grand. But it was hers, or at least, it was supposed to be. Beside her, once, had stood a man named James. A calculating yet charming CEO who had disappeared from her life only to return with promises of stability, care, and a future together. She had believed him. She had believed that this time, he would stay. That together, they would create something real, not just a house, but a home. Yet what truly changed Diep's heart wasn't James, or the house, or the idea of safety. It was a little girl named Nhi. A child who had wandered into her life like sunlight spilling quietly through the leaves, warming places in her soul that had long gone cold. Every morning, Diep would gently tie Nhi's hair, listen to her talk about the trees, the clouds, their tiny adventures. With every laugh, every question, every little hand reaching for hers, Diep began to understand that motherhood didn't begin with blood. It began with love, with presence, with the willingness to stay when it was easier to walk away. One day, James told her that Nhi's grandparents had refused custody. The girl had no one else. If no guardian stepped forward, she would be taken to an orphanage, far away, unfamiliar, and likely unkind. Diep's heart broke. Not because she didn't want to care for Nhi, but because she feared she wouldn't be able to. She had no legal assets, no stable income, nothing that proved she could raise a child. But the idea of Nhi growing up without a family hurt more than any of her own fears. She asked herself, if not her, then who? And so, she made a choice. She would adopt Nhi. In the tender, fragile moment when she shared this decision, James reached out and promised to help. He said he would support her, provide the financial proof the legal process required, and help her become Nhi's official mother. For the first time in years, Diep let herself believe in a future that felt whole. She held Nhi and asked her softly, "Do you want to live with me forever? Until you grow up?" Nhi nodded. Eyes wide. Voice clear, "Yes. And if you had to leave me, would you be sad?" "Yes." "Why do you like living with me?" "Because you play with me and take me to pick fruit." It was such a simple answer, but it pierced through all of Diep's hesitation. Her love for this child wasn't fleeting, it was real. It was rooted. She was ready to be a mother. Not in theory, but in action. In sacrifice. Then, with quiet trust, she approached James with a request to transfer the ownership of the Pomelo Hill property, currently under his name, into hers, so she could legally meet the requirements for adoption. She believed he would understand. She believed he would say yes. But he didn't. His voice wasn't raised, but it was cold, detached. "You're taking this too seriously," he said. "This isn't what I expected." Diep stood there, stunned. The man who once promised to stand beside her now hesitated at the first true step of commitment. Did he think her love for Nhi was some emotional impulse? Something temporary? She felt the sharp sting of betrayal, not for the land or the money, but for the promise that had just died between them. Still, she didn't cry. When Nhi asked her quietly, "Can I still stay with you?" Diep just held her tighter and said nothing. That silence, heavy and full, said everything. James stepped out of the picture just as quietly as he had entered. But Diep didn't stop. With no support, no backing, she walked into the local authorities' office alone and submitted the adoption request. They told her the truth: without property, without a stable income, she didn't meet the legal qualifications. They couldn't approve the request. But she didn't beg for pity, she pleaded for a chance. Just one chance. She returned home empty-handed and emotionally drained. And there, on the step of their half-built house, Nhi was sitting, holding a ripe papaya they had picked together that morning. "Will I get to stay with you?" the little girl asked. Diep didn't answer with words. She simply wrapped her arms around her and let the silence speak. In that moment, she became a mother, not because the law allowed it. Not because James had supported her. But because her heart had already split in two. One half of it would forever belong to Nhi. James never came back. Perhaps he was never ready. Perhaps he was afraid. But Diep didn't hate him. She understood that not everyone has the strength to walk a road paved with sacrifice. So, she walked it alone. Because sometimes, being a mother is not about what you have. It's about what you're willing to give. Even when the wind pushes against you. When the person you trusted turns away. When you're left with nothing but love and quiet hope, you keep walking. And somewhere, between the falling fruit, the broken promises, the tears she never let Nhi see, and the laughter of a child who still believed in tomorrow, Diep understood one thing: she didn't need someone to hold her hand. She just needed the strength to hold on to Nhi's, and never let go.